under the scorching midday sun, which relentlessly baked the African savannah, a little girl named Amara walked alongside her family through the thick underbrush of the jungle. Their path led them across a small river, a natural barrier between their village and the dense forest. Amara's family was in a hurry to return home before nightfall, for the jungle at night turned into a deadly trap. But fate had other plans. As they reached the river, the adults began crossing to the other side, carrying the younger children on their backs. Amara walked at the end of the line, holding tightly to her older sister Malika's hand. But just as they approached the water, Malika spotted something in the bushes, and forgetting about Amara for a moment, let go of her hand. At that instant, the adults had already made it across the river, and Malika rushed after them, assuming Amara was right behind her. Amara stopped at the water's edge, frozen in place. She waited for someone to return for her, but no one did. She couldn't call out for help, her voice lost in the noise of the jungle, and no one noticed her absence. Minutes passed, and Amara realized she was alone. Her heart pounded as she grasped the reality that her family had left her behind. Panic and fear surged through her small body. Amara darted back into the jungle, trying to retrace their steps, but every tree, every bush looked the same. She was lost, and the thick vegetation seemed to close in around her, trapping her in a green maze. Hours passed, and the sun began to sink toward the horizon. Amara was terrified and exhausted. Her legs were scratched from sharp branches, and her clothes were torn. She tripped over a root and fell to the ground, bursting into tears of helplessness. Her tears soaked into the dry earth, but no one heard her sobs. No one came to help. Amara knew she needed to find shelter before darkness fell. She stood up, wiping her face with dirty hands, and stumbled forward, tripping over the roots of the trees. The jungle grew thicker, and the light struggled to penetrate the dense canopy. At last she came across a small cave hidden behind a thick cluster of bushes. It was the best shelter she could find. Crawling inside, Amara curled up on the cold ground. Despite the heat outside, she felt a chill run through her body. She listened to every sound, expecting something or someone to emerge from the darkness. The jungle came alive at night, and Amara was painfully aware of how exposed she was. The sounds of the jungle at night were terrifying, a cacophony of insects buzzing, distant howls, and the rustling of unseen creatures. Amara's imagination ran wild, turning every shadow into a lurking predator. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the noises, but they seemed to grow louder in the silence of her solitude. As the night deepened, Amara's fear was joined by a crushing sense of loneliness. She missed her family desperately. The familiar warmth of her mother's embrace, the sound of her father's voice, even the annoying teasing from her siblings, all of it felt like a distant memory, something she might never experience again. She tried to stay awake, too scared to sleep, but exhaustion eventually overtook her. Her small body couldn't resist the pull of sleep any longer. Amara's last thoughts before she drifted off were a fervent hope that she would wake up to find that this was all just a bad dream, that her family would be there, smiling and telling her everything would be okay. But as she slipped into unconsciousness, the reality of her situation lingered in the back of her mind, a dark cloud she couldn't escape. The jungle had claimed her, and now she was alone. When Amara woke up the next morning, the jungle was already alive with the sounds of nature. The bright, early sunlight filtered through the thick canopy of leaves above, casting dappled patterns on the ground around her. For a brief moment she forgot where she was, but the realization of her situation quickly came crashing back, and fear gripped her once again. She sat up slowly, her body aching from sleeping on the hard, cold ground. Her clothes were damp with morning dew, and she shivered as a cool breeze swept through the cave. But there was no time to dwell on her discomfort. Amara knew she couldn't stay in one place for too long. She needed to find food and water if she had any hope of surviving. Amara cautiously crawled out of the cave, her eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. The jungle seemed even more intimidating in the daylight, with its towering trees, thick vines, and endless stretches of underbrush. But she had no choice, she had to move forward. The first thing she needed was water. Amara remembered the river they had crossed the day before, but she had no idea how to find her way back to it. Instead, she decided to listen carefully, hoping to hear the sound of running water. The jungle was filled with noises, bird calls, the rustling of leaves, the occasional distant roar of an animal, but none of it sounded like water. She began walking, her small feet careful not to trip over the roots and rocks that littered the jungle floor. As she moved deeper into the jungle, she kept a lookout for anything that might help her survive. She didn't know much about the plants and animals around her, but she remembered a few things her mother had taught her about the forest near their village. After what felt like hours of wandering, Amara's throat was dry, and she was growing desperate. That's when she spotted a cluster of large, broad-leafed plants. She recognized them from her mother's stories, banana trees. Her heart leapt with hope. Bananas would provide both food and moisture. Amara hurried over to the trees and began searching for fruit. It didn't take long to find a bunch of small, green bananas hanging from a low branch. They weren't ripe, but she didn't care. She reached up, tugging at the bunch until it came loose, and then sat down on the ground to eat. The bananas were hard and bitter, but Amara forced herself to chew and swallow. It wasn't much, but it gave her a bit of strength, enough to continue searching for water. She knew she couldn't survive long on bananas alone. She decided to keep moving, this time heading in the direction where the trees seemed to thin out slightly. The underbrush wasn't as dense, and the ground sloped gently downward, both signs that there might be water nearby. Amara's hope was reignited as she pushed through the vegetation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she heard a faint but unmistakable sound of water trickling over rocks. Amara's pace quickened, and she soon found herself standing at the edge of a small stream. The water was clear and cool, a stark contrast to the heat of the jungle. Amara knelt down and cupped her hands in the water, bringing it to her parched lips. The water tasted pure and fresh, and she drank greedily, feeling the cool liquid soothe her dry throat. For the first time since being left behind, Amara felt a small spark of hope. She had found water, and with that, she had taken her first real step towards survival. But she knew that finding water was just the beginning. Amara's mother had always told her that the jungle was full of hidden dangers, and that even the smallest mistake could be fatal. She needed to stay alert, to think carefully about every move she made. As she sat by the stream, Amara began to plan her next steps. She needed to find a more permanent shelter, something safer than the small cave she had slept in the night before. She also needed to gather more food, and perhaps find a way to protect herself from the wild animals that roamed the jungle. With these thoughts in mind, Amara stood up, feeling a newfound determination. She was scared, yes, but she was also strong. She had to be. There was no one else to rely on, no one to help her. If she was going to survive, she would have to do it on her own. Amara took a deep breath and looked around. The jungle, which had seemed so overwhelming and hostile the day before, now felt like a challenge she had to face. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to try. She had no other choice. As she began to walk along the stream, following its winding path through the jungle, Amara felt a small sense of pride. She had survived her first night alone in the jungle, and she had found water. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And sometimes a small start was all you needed. As the days in the jungle passed, Amara's struggle for survival grew more intense. Each new day seemed to bring a fresh set of challenges, as if the jungle itself was testing her resolve. What had once been a terrifying and bewildering place was slowly becoming familiar. But this familiarity bred a different kind of fear, a fear of the unknown dangers lurking in every shadow, behind every tree, and within every rustle of leaves. Amara had managed to find a more secure shelter after her first terrifying night alone in the cave. She discovered a large, hollowed-out tree that provided a bit more protection from the elements and the creatures of the jungle. This tree became her home, a place she could return to at the end of each grueling day, offering a semblance of safety, though not true security. She lined the inside with leaves and moss, creating a makeshift bed that was at least softer than the cold, hard ground. She also covered the entrance with branches and leaves to hide herself from prying eyes, whether they belonged to animals or something else. But the jungle was relentless in its cruelty. It seemed to sense her presence, to know her weaknesses, and to exploit them mercilessly. One night, As she lay curled up in her hollow tree, trying to coax herself into sleep, she heard something moving outside. The noise was subtle at first, just the faint rustling of leaves, but it quickly grew louder, more insistent. Amara's heart began to pound in her chest as she strained her ears, trying to make sense of the sound. And then she heard it, a low, guttural growl that sent chills down her spine. She knew that sound. It was the growl of a leopard, one of the most feared predators in the jungle. Her body froze with terror. Every muscle tensed as she listened to the creature move closer. The growl became a deep, resonant rumble that echoed in the quiet of the night, and she could hear the soft, deliberate steps of the leopard as it padded through the underbrush, searching for prey. Amara's breath came in short, shallow gasps, her mind racing with fear. She knew that if the leopard found her, there would be no escape. It would be over in moments. She pressed herself deeper into the hollow of the tree, trying to make herself as small and unnoticeable as possible. The growling grew louder, and she could hear the beast sniffing at the entrance to her shelter. The sound was so close she could feel the vibration of its breath through the wood. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she bit down on her lip to keep from crying out. She wanted to scream, to run, but she knew that any movement would only draw the leopard's attention. All she could do was wait, her heart pounding so loudly in her ears that she was sure the leopard could hear it too. She prayed silently, begging whatever forces governed the jungle to spare her just this once. Minutes felt like hours as Amara lay in the darkness, her whole body trembling. The growling continued, but the leopard seemed to lose interest in her shelter. She heard it move away, the sound of its footsteps growing fainter as it disappeared into the night. Amara didn't move until the silence was absolute, and even then, she waited a long time before daring to take a breath. When she finally did, it came out in a shaky gasp, and she collapsed back onto her bed of leaves, too drained to do anything but tremble in the aftermath of her fear. Sleep did not come easily that night. Every noise outside the hollow tree sent fresh waves of terror through her body, keeping her on edge. The jungle felt more dangerous than ever, and Amara realized just how precarious her situation truly was. She had survived this encounter, but there would be others, and she could not rely on luck to save her every time. The next morning, Amara ventured out of her shelter with a renewed sense of caution. The jungle seemed more ominous in the daylight, its shadows deeper, its sounds more threatening. She was hungry, her stomach growling in protest as she searched for food. But her fear of the night before made her more cautious, more hesitant to stray too far from her tree. She had to find something to eat, but the jungle's abundance was also its danger. Many of the plants were unfamiliar to her, and she knew that some were poisonous. Her mother had taught her a few basic survival skills, but the lessons felt distant, faded with time and fear. She remembered being told about certain plants that were safe to eat, but the details were hazy. Still, she had no choice. She had to eat. After several hours of searching, Amara came across a cluster of small, red berries growing on a low bush. They looked inviting, plump, shiny, and almost glowing in the sunlight. She hesitated, her mother's warning echoing in her mind, but hunger got the better of her. She carefully picked a few berries and examined them, hoping to remember if they were safe. But her memory failed her, and in her desperation she took the risk. The berries tasted sweet at first, a burst of flavor that briefly soothed her hunger. But as she swallowed, the sweetness turned bitter, and an unpleasant aftertaste lingered on her tongue. Amara's stomach twisted in discomfort, and a cold wave of dread washed over her. She had made a mistake. The berries were poisonous. Panic set in as the pain in her stomach intensified, growing from a dull ache to sharp, stabbing cramps. Amara doubled over, clutching her midsection, trying to fight the nausea that threatened to overwhelm her. But it was no use. Her body convulsed as she vomited, trying to expel the poison she had ingested, but the damage had already been done. She collapsed onto the ground, her body trembling uncontrollably as the poison coursed through her veins. Her vision blurred, and the world around her seemed to spin wildly out of control. The jungle, which had already been a place of fear and uncertainty, now became a nightmarish landscape of twisted shapes and dark shadows. Every sound, every movement seemed amplified, distorted by the pain and confusion that gripped her. Amara didn't know how long she lay there, her body racked with pain, her mind lost in a fog of fear and delirium. Time lost all meaning as she slipped in and out of consciousness, her thoughts disjointed and chaotic. She could feel the life draining out of her, and for the first time, the thought of death seemed like a release, a way to escape the endless suffering. But somewhere deep inside her, a small, stubborn voice refused to give up. It whispered to her, urging her to hold on, to fight through the pain. That voice was a lifeline, a thread of hope in the midst of overwhelming despair. Amara clung to it, using it to pull herself back from the brink. Eventually, the pain began to subside, though it left her weak and exhausted. Her body was drenched in sweat, and she was too weak to stand. All she could do was crawl, dragging herself inch by inch back to her hollow tree, her fingers digging into the dirt as she fought to stay conscious. The journey back to her shelter seemed to take forever, every movement an agonizing effort. When she finally reached the tree, Amara collapsed inside, too weak to do anything but lie there, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had never felt so fragile, so close to the edge. The jungle had brought her to her knees, and it took every ounce of her remaining strength to keep from succumbing to despair. For days after the poisoning, Amara was unable to do much more than rest. She was too weak to venture far from her shelter, her body slowly recovering from the trauma it had endured. She lived off the small reserves of food she had gathered earlier, rationing them carefully as her strength gradually returned. But even as her body healed, her mind was haunted by the knowledge of how close she had come to death. The experience changed her. She became more cautious, more deliberate in her actions. Every plant she encountered was scrutinized, tested with the utmost care before she dared to eat it. She avoided any food she wasn't absolutely certain was safe, even if it meant going hungry. She stayed closer to her shelter, venturing out only when necessary, and always keeping her senses sharp, alert for any sign of danger. The jungle continued to test her. There were days when the rain came down in torrents, drenching her to the bone and turning the jungle floor into a muddy, treacherous mess. Nights when the howls and roars of unseen animals filled the darkness, reminding her of the predators that prowled just beyond her shelter. The insects, relentless and biting, were a constant torment, leaving her skin raw and itchy. Yet through it all, Amara endured. She had been pushed to her limits, but she had found a strength within herself that she never knew existed. A resilience born of necessity, forged in the crucible of the jungle's merciless trials. She was still afraid, how could she not be? But she was also determined. She had survived this long, and she would continue to survive. No matter what the jungle threw at her, she would endure. Amara knew that her battle was far from over. The jungle was vast, and she was still lost, still alone. But she had learned to adapt, to think on her feet, to outwit the dangers that surrounded her. She was no longer the helpless child who had been abandoned in the jungle. She was a survivor, and she would keep fighting until she found her way back to safety. Days turned into weeks, and Amara's life in the jungle became a delicate balance of survival and fear. Each morning, she awoke with the rising sun, her body still weak from the effects of the poison, but her spirit unbroken. The jungle was relentless, a constant presence that loomed over her every move, but Amara had learned to navigate its dangers. She had become attuned to its rhythms, its sounds, and even its silences, which often held the most ominous threats. Her daily routine was simple but vital. She would venture out from her hollow tree shelter at first light, moving cautiously through the underbrush in search of food and water. The lessons from her previous mistakes had made her more careful, more observant. Every berry, every leaf, every root was scrutinized before it was touched, let alone eaten. The jungle was both her enemy and her teacher, and Amara had become an unwilling but determined student. One morning, as the sun filtered through the dense canopy above, casting long shadows on the jungle floor, Amara set out on her usual search for food. The air was thick with humidity, and the sounds of the jungle were a constant buzz around her, birds calling to one another, insects humming in the underbrush, and the occasional distant roar of an animal. The jungle was alive, teeming with life, and yet it was also eerily silent when it needed to be, as if it could sense her presence and was waiting, watching. Amara had ventured further than usual that day, driven by the need to find more substantial food. The small fruits and edible plants she had been surviving on were not enough to sustain her for long, and she knew she needed something more nourishing if she was going to keep up her strength. She moved carefully, her senses on high alert, every rustle of leaves making her pause and listen. As she made her way through a particularly dense patch of jungle, she noticed something unusual on the ground. At first, she thought it was just another set of animal tracks. She had seen plenty of those during her time in the jungle, but these were different. The prints were larger and more deliberate, and they seemed to form a trail. Her heart skipped a beat as she knelt down to examine them more closely. The tracks were human. Amara's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't seen another person since the day her family had accidentally left her behind. The realization that there might be someone else out here, someone who could help her, filled her with a mixture of hope and fear. Hope that she might finally be saved, and fear that whoever had made these tracks might not be friendly. She debated with herself for a moment, unsure whether to follow the trail. What if it led her to danger? But the alternative was to continue wandering the jungle alone, with no idea of where she was going or how she would survive in the long term. The decision was made for her when she noticed that the tracks were fresh. Whoever had made them had passed through recently. This could be her only chance. Amara steeled herself and began to follow the tracks. They led her deeper into the jungle, through thick underbrush and over uneven terrain. The going was slow and difficult, but she was determined. The possibility of finding another person, of not being alone anymore, drove her forward despite her fear. The tracks led her to a small clearing, where she stopped to rest for a moment, catching her breath and surveying her surroundings. The clearing was quiet, the usual sounds of the jungle muted, as if even the animals were holding their breath. In the center of the clearing, she noticed something else: small piles of stones arranged in a deliberate pattern. It was a sign unmistakably made by human hands. Amara's heart raced as she approached the stones. She had seen something like this before, back in her village, where they would arrange stones in patterns to mark paths or to send messages to others. It was a sign that someone had been here, and not too long ago. But who? And where were they now? She continued to follow the tracks, her anxiety growing with each step. The jungle seemed to close in around her, the trees towering above, their branches intertwining to form a thick canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The path grew narrower and the underbrush more tangled, but the tracks remained visible, guiding her forward. As she pushed through a particularly dense thicket, Amara stumbled into another clearing. This one was larger, with a small stream running through it. The sound of the water was a welcome relief to her parched throat, and she hurried to the edge of the stream, kneeling to drink deeply. The cool water soothed her, giving her a moment of peace in the midst of her anxiety. But as she drank, she noticed something that made her heart skip a beat: a small, makeshift campsite on the other side of the clearing. There was a fire pit, with ashes still warm, and a few scattered belongings: a worn-out backpack, a couple of tin cans, and some tools. Amara froze, her instincts telling her to hide, but her curiosity compelling her to move closer. She crept toward the campsite, her eyes scanning the area for any sign of its owner. The camp looked abandoned, but not for long. The warmth of the ashes suggested that whoever had been here might return at any moment. Amara's heart pounded in her chest as she debated what to do. Should she stay and wait for them? Or should she take what she could and leave before they came back? Her decision was made for her when she heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. Amara's breath caught in her throat, and she quickly ducked behind a tree, peering out from behind the trunk. The rustling grew louder, and then, to her amazement, a figure emerged from the underbrush. It was a man, tall and lean, with dark skin and a weathered face. He was dressed in worn clothes, patched and mended in places, and he carried a machete in one hand. He looked like he had been living in the jungle for a long time, his movements cautious and deliberate as he approached the campsite. Amara's heart raced as she watched him, unsure of what to do. The man didn't seem to notice her at first. He set down his machete and began tending to the fire, adding more wood to the pit and stirring the ashes to rekindle the flames. Amara stayed hidden, her mind racing with questions. Who was he? How had he ended up here? And most importantly, could she trust him? As she watched him work, something inside her shifted. This was her chance, her only chance to find help. She couldn't stay hidden forever, and if she waited too long, the opportunity might slip away. Summoning every ounce of courage she had, Amara stepped out from behind the tree.
"Hello,"
she said, her voice trembling with fear and hope. The man spun around, his eyes wide with surprise. For a moment, neither of them moved, both frozen in place by the shock of the encounter. Then, slowly, the man lowered his machete, his expression softening.
"Hello,"
he replied cautiously, his voice rough from disuse. Amara took a hesitant step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. I've been lost," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My family. They left me behind." The man's eyes widened further, and he took a step closer, his gaze softening with understanding.
"You've been alone all this time?"
he asked, his tone gentle. Amara nodded, feeling tears prick at the corners of her eyes. The reality of her situation, the loneliness, the fear, it all came crashing down on her at once. She had been strong for so long, but now, faced with another human being, the dam broke. She began to cry, her small body shaking with sobs. The man hesitated for a moment, then slowly approached her, his movements careful and non-threatening. "It's okay," he said softly.
"You're safe now."
Amara looked up at him through her tears, searching his face for any sign of deceit, but all she saw was concern and a weary kindness. Something about him reassured her, made her feel that she could trust him. She took another step forward, and then another, until she was close enough to see the lines of age and hardship etched into his face.
"I'm Amara,"
she said, her voice still trembling. The man smiled faintly, a tired but genuine expression. "Amara," he repeated, as if committing the name to memory.
"I'm Kofi. May?"
For the first time since being left behind, Amara felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't alone anymore. Kofi motioned for her to sit by the fire, and she gratefully sank down onto the ground, feeling the warmth of the flames against her skin. He handed her a tin cup filled with water, and she drank deeply, the cool liquid soothing her dry throat. As she drank, Kofi began to speak, telling her his story. He had been living in the jungle for several months, ever since he had become separated from his own group. Like Amara, he had been left behind, though in his case it had been due to an attack by a group of bandits who had ambushed them while they were traveling. Kofi had managed to escape into the jungle, but he had lost everything in the process: his friends, his supplies, and his way back home. The jungle had been unforgiving to him as well. He had survived by his wits and his knowledge of the land, but it had been a hard, lonely existence. The thought of finding another person, especially a child like Amara, had never even crossed his mind. Yet here she was, a small, brave girl who had managed to survive on her own in this harsh environment. As he spoke, Amara felt a sense of connection with him, a bond forged by their shared experiences of loss and survival. She listened intently as he described the challenges he had faced, the dangers he had encountered, and the ways he had managed to stay alive. It was a story of resilience, of determination, and of finding strength in the face of overwhelming odds. Kofi told her that he had been planning to leave the jungle soon, to try and find a way back to civilization. The jungle had taken its toll on him, and he knew he couldn't stay here forever. But now that he had found Amara, his plans had changed. He couldn't leave her behind, not after everything she had been through.
"We'll get out of here together,"
he promised, his voice steady and reassuring.
"I'll help you find your way back to your family."
Amara looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and hope. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel alone. She had someone to rely on, someone who understood what she had been through. And that made all the difference. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the clearing, Amara and Kofi sat by the fire, talking quietly about their plans. They would rest for the night and then set out at first light, following the stream in the hope that it would lead them to a river or a village. Kofi believed that they weren't too far from civilization, and with his knowledge of the jungle, they had a good chance of finding their way out. That night, as Amara lay by the fire, wrapped in a blanket Kofi had given her, she felt a sense of peace that she hadn't felt in a long time. The jungle was still out there, still dangerous, but it no longer felt like an insurmountable threat. She had hope now, and with Kofi by her side, she believed that she could make it through whatever lay ahead. The night passed in relative peace, the first Amara had experienced since being lost in the jungle. She awoke at dawn, feeling a sense of cautious optimism. The morning air was cool, and the fire had burned down to embers, but its warmth lingered in the small clearing where she and Kofi had camped. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Amara didn't feel the sharp edge of fear pressing down on her. She wasn't alone anymore, and that simple fact brought her a comfort she hadn't known she needed so desperately. Kofi was already awake, crouched by the stream, his hands moving methodically as he prepared for the day ahead. He had told her the night before that they would follow the stream until it led them to a larger river, where they might find a path out of the jungle. The plan wasn't without its risks. Rivers were dangerous places in the wild, often teeming with predators, but it was their best option. Amara joined him by the stream, splashing water on her face to wash away the remnants of sleep. Kofi handed her a small piece of dried meat, which she accepted gratefully, though the tough texture and strong taste were unfamiliar. It was food, and that was all that mattered. As they prepared to leave, Kofi gave Amara a quick lesson in jungle navigation. He showed her how to use the sun to keep track of direction, how to recognize certain plants and trees that indicated the presence of water, and how to listen for the subtle sounds of the jungle that could signal danger or safety. Amara absorbed the information eagerly. Every bit of knowledge felt like a lifeline in this vast, unforgiving world. With the sun climbing higher in the sky, they set out, following the stream's meandering course through the jungle. The terrain was rough, the underbrush thick and often treacherous, but Kofi moved with a confidence born of experience, and Amara followed closely behind, trusting his instincts. The jungle, though still daunting, no longer felt like an insurmountable enemy. It was a challenge, yes, but one they were determined to overcome together. As they walked, Kofi shared more of his story with Amara. He told her about his life before the jungle, about the village where he had grown up, and the family he had lost to the same bandits who had forced him into the wild. His voice was steady as he spoke, but Amara could hear the pain beneath his words, the weight of loss that had driven him to survive. In return, Amara told him about her family, about the day they had crossed the river and she had been left behind. She spoke of her mother's gentle smile, her father's strong hands, and the siblings she missed more than anything. Their shared stories forged a bond between them, a connection that went beyond mere survival. They understood each other in a way that only those who have faced the worst can, and in that understanding they found strength to keep moving, to keep hoping. The day stretched on, the jungle dense and humid, but the stream was a constant guide, leading them ever forward. They paused occasionally to rest, to drink from the clear water, and to take stock of their surroundings. The jungle was never silent, even in the stillest moments. It buzzed with life, a reminder that they were not alone in this vast wilderness. As the afternoon wore on, the sound of the stream began to change, growing louder and more insistent. Kofi quickened his pace, and Amara followed, her heart beating faster with anticipation. When they broke through the thick underbrush and into a wide clearing, they were met with the sight of a large, flowing river. The river was a broad, powerful current, its surface glittering in the sunlight. It was both a promise of safety and a reminder of the dangers they still faced. Rivers were lifelines in the jungle, but they were also home to some of its most formidable predators. Kofi studied the river for a moment, his expression thoughtful.
This is good.
He said finally, turning to Amara.
We can follow the river downstream. It should lead us to a village or a crossing point. We're getting closer.
Amara nodded, feeling a swell of hope. The river was a tangible sign of progress, a step closer to home. But as they began to follow its banks, the reality of the situation became clear. The jungle was denser here, the undergrowth thicker and more difficult to navigate. And there were other signs too: tracks in the mud along the riverbank, the distinctive markings of animals that came to drink or hunt. They moved cautiously, aware that the river, while a source of life, was also a potential trap. Amara's senses were heightened, every sound and movement catching her attention. The jungle, which had seemed almost friendly in the morning light, now felt more threatening. But Kofi's presence was a constant reassurance, his calm demeanor and steady pace giving her the courage to keep going. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the jungle, when they heard at a distant, rhythmic sound, unlike anything Amara had heard before. It was faint at first, just a low, steady thrum that seemed to vibrate through the ground. Kofi stopped in his tracks, his eyes narrowing as he listened.
What is it?
Amara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kofi didn't answer immediately. He was focused, his head tilted slightly as he tried to pinpoint the source of the sound. Then, suddenly, his expression changed, a flicker of recognition, followed by something Amara hadn't seen before: fear.
Drums. Rums.
He said quietly, his voice tense. We need to move. Now. Amara didn't question him. The urgency in his voice was enough. They began to move quickly along the riverbank, Kofi's pace brisk and determined. The sound of the drums grew louder, more insistent, a steady beat that echoed through the jungle. Amara's heart raced, fear gnawing at her as she struggled to keep up with Kofi's long strides.
Who are they?
Amara asked breathlessly as they pushed through a particularly thick patch of undergrowth. Kofi glanced back at her, his expression grim. There are people in the jungle who are not friendly. Bandits, raiders, sometimes even slavers. We don't want to be found by them. Amara's stomach twisted with fear. The thought of encountering such people was terrifying, but there was no time to dwell on it. They had to keep moving, to stay ahead of the sound of the drums that seemed to be closing in on them. As night fell, the jungle became a maze of shadows and half-seen shapes. The darkness was almost complete, the only light coming from the pale sliver of the moon that occasionally broke through the canopy. The drums continued, their rhythm unbroken, a relentless pursuit that seemed to follow them no matter which direction they took. Kofi led them away from the river, into the deeper parts of the jungle, where the undergrowth was thicker and the ground more uneven. Amara struggled to keep up, her legs aching, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But she didn't complain. She knew that stopping wasn't an option. Finally, after what felt like hours of running, Kofi slowed to a stop in a small, hidden clearing. The drums were still audible, but they seemed farther away now, muffled by the dense jungle. Kofi knelt down, his breathing heavy, and motioned for Amara to do the same.
We need to rest.
He said quietly, his voice low.
Just for a moment. We can't let them catch us.
Amara nodded, sinking to the ground beside him. Her body was exhausted, every muscle aching from the strain of their flight. But the fear kept her alert, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The jungle was alive with the sounds of the night crickets chirping, frogs croaking, and the occasional distant call of an animal. But the drums, while quieter, were still there, a constant reminder of the danger they were in. They stayed in the clearing for only a few minutes before Kofi urged them to move again. The night was long and harrowing, a tense journey through the darkest parts of the jungle. But finally, as the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, the sound of the drums faded completely, leaving only the soft rustling of leaves and the distant murmur of the river. Kofi slowed his pace, his posture relaxing slightly as they continued their journey. Amara felt a wave of relief wash over her, though she knew they weren't out of danger yet. But the fact that they had escaped the drums, that they were still free, was a victory in itself. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, they came across something that made Amara's heart leap with hope: a narrow, worn path cutting through the jungle. It was overgrown in places, but it was unmistakably a path made by humans. Kofi examined the path for a moment before turning to Amara with a small smile. "This is it," he said, his voice filled with quiet triumph. "This path will lead us to a village. We're almost there." Amara could hardly believe it. After everything they had been through, after all the fear and uncertainty, they were finally close to safety. She felt tears prick at her eyes, but this time they were tears of relief. They followed the path, their steps quickening as the jungle began to thin out, the trees giving way to more open terrain. And then, just as the sun reached its peak, they emerged from the jungle into a small, bustling village. The village was a simple place with mud brick huts and thatched roofs, but to Amara, it was the most beautiful sight she had ever seen. The villagers, who were going about their daily routines, stopped and stared as she and Kofi approached, their expressions a mixture of surprise and curiosity. Kofi raised his hand in greeting, and after a moment, a tall, older man stepped forward from the crowd, his face breaking into a wide smile. He and Kofi exchanged a few words in a language Amara didn't understand, and then the man turned to her, his expression softening.
"You are safe here,"
he said in a thick accent, his voice kind.
"You both are."
Amara felt a rush of emotions: relief, exhaustion, gratitude all at once. She had made it. She had survived the jungle, and now she was finally safe. The villagers welcomed them warmly, offering food, water, and a place to rest. Amara could hardly keep her eyes open as she was led to a small hut, where a soft bed awaited her. The moment her head hit the pillow, she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, her body finally giving in to the exhaustion that had been building for so long. When she awoke, it was late afternoon, and the sun was beginning to set again. Kofi was sitting outside the hut, talking with some of the villagers. He looked up as she stepped outside, and a smile spread across his face.
"How do you feel?"
he asked. Amara smiled back, feeling lighter than she had in days. "Better," she said simply. Kofi nodded, his expression thoughtful.
"We'll stay here for a little while, until you're fully recovered,"
he said.
"And then we'll find your family."
The words were like a balm to Amara's soul. The thought of being reunited with her family, of seeing their faces again, was almost too much to hope for. But with Kofi by her side, she believed it was possible. The days in the village passed quickly. Amara regained her strength, and Kofi made arrangements to continue their journey. The villagers provided them with supplies and offered directions to the nearest town, where they could find transportation back to Amara's home. On the morning they were to leave, the villagers gathered to see them off, offering well wishes and gifts for the journey. Amara felt a deep sense of gratitude for their kindness, but she was also eager to be on her way. The jungle, which had once been her prison, was now behind her, and the road ahead was clear. As they walked away from the village, following the path that would lead them back to civilization, Amara looked up at Kofi, her heart full of hope.
Thank you,
she said quietly. For everything. Kofi smiled down at her, his eyes filled with warmth. You don't need to thank me, Amara. We're in this together. And with that, they continued on their journey, leaving the jungle and the fear behind.